Okay, a very big welcome to Denbigh Amateur Radio Society and to those who are watching the live broadcast from Zoom and also watching the live broadcast on YouTube and those that catch up on video later in the week or the month. Just to say that our YouTube channel now is extremely popular. We've got 816 subscribers to Denbigh Dale's YouTube channel and a lively group of people who contact us there. One of the contacts, by the way, that we're getting lots of people commenting on is the digital amateur radio net we run on a Thursday night from 7:30 p.m. and 18:30 Zulu, which is contactable through the Reflector XLX 305D, which will accept DMR and D-Star entry to it. We're broadcasting that live on YouTube as well, and we've collected a nice group of people who pop in and watch it live or watch it or listen to it again during the week. So a big welcome to you. And a very big welcome tonight to our speaker, James G8GLL, who's a member of the Poldhu Amateur Radio Club. And for everyone in Great Britain who, as we were discussing much earlier on this evening, thinks that Cornwall is bathed in sunshine for 364 days of the year and beautiful blue skies and beautiful beaches. Of course, there are beautiful beaches and beautiful blue skies in Cornwall, but sadly, the weather there can be, challenging. And I have some friends who recently went camping down in Cornwall and suffered the terrible problems they had with their tents in the wind. But a very good welcome to you, James. And I know you're also a member of the Poldhu Amateur Radio Club. And the reason for inviting James tonight to come and give his talk to the club is that this year, in fact, I think it's the day after tomorrow, is the 150th anniversary of the birth of Marconi. And Marconi, as we'll be hearing from James later, is an interesting man. But one who, in public parlance, is credited as being the father of radio. Since we're in a meeting and we're going to be watched by people interested in radio and amateur radio, of course, the truth is for all scientific discoveries, they're never down to one person. So we've got these wonderful scientists who have been given these names. In Marconi's case, the father of radio, which is distinctly unfair to all kinds of people. And as has been pointed out to me on our social media channels, lots of people standing up for Nikola Tesla, saying he's the father of radio, and Marconi pinched all his ideas in the first place. But I think it's wonderful to have that controversy, but it's also wonderful just to look back in history a little bit and examine what people were doing, just 150 years ago in terms of Marconi's birth. But his career, as James will tell us, spans quite a lengthy period and quite a colourful life. So James, without stealing any of your talk, I'll hand the microphone over to you and let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Now, if this all works, I should be able to share this screen with you. And hopefully
we can see that. That's fine.
You can see the slides. That's good. That's brilliant. Well, thank you for the introduction, Nick. I'm actually very humbled to be invited to talk to you this evening. It's all sprung out of, I guess I'm the person in the club who's prepared to stand up and make a fool of himself, but they keep calling on me. As Nick said, actually it's tomorrow is the 150th anniversary of Marconi's birth. So we're having a bit of a celebration up at the club. And of course, we've got the local TV and people are getting involved. So somebody pushed me forward for that as well. So yeah, okay. Let's see if we can get through this without further ado, as they say. Yeah, just again going back to what you were saying there, Nick. Marconi is the father of radio. I think some people have called him the inventor of radio, which is probably, as you say, that's going a little bit too far. I think his sort of fatherly aspects were the fact that he commercialized the technology. All those other great people, and they were great people, and you know, Tesla mentioned, but you've got Hertz and Popov and people like that. They were all the people either discovered or invented, whichever way you look at it, the technologies. Marconi brought them all together, and that was the clever bit. I mean, he brought the coherer from Branly, and the work of Hertz, and developed it all. He improved the coherer, and put it all together and made something that worked. And that was the genius of Marconi. It's very interesting that as a sort of a student of science, he wasn't very successful. He was sort of privately schooled, very much at the instigation of his parents, or his mother in particular. And he didn't do that well at school, really, but she introduced him to some very good people. He had a private tutor, a technical tutor, but he was also introduced to Professor Righi at Bologna University, and he gave him access to the library and also some of his lectures. But actually, Marconi didn't have anywhere near, he couldn't be admitted to the university as a student because he just didn't have the qualifications. But he had, you know, he obviously had a great deal of personality. He was very capable of in the business world of negotiating. He was also a talented pianist as well, which I don't know if that sort of compliments at all. Okay, so yeah, Marconi, he was born April 25th in 1874 in Bologna. Now his mother was a part of the Jameson family, and the people, the Northern Ireland family of the Jameson's whiskey brand. So they were good business people. They understood business and they had good contacts. His father, Giuseppe, was Italian, sort of middling aristocracy. So he was sort of quite highly born in many respects. But he was lucky he had this both a British and Italian background. He was brought to England by his mother until the age of 6, and his English was excellent. If you ever come across any recordings of him speaking, it's very much like anyone you would have heard on the BBC of that sort of era. So he was actually, when he went back as a young man to Italy to continue his education, he was actually bullied at school because he didn't sound Italian enough. But obviously being bilingual helped him a great deal. But he ended up, and I mean, I want to talk really about Marconi the man more than the technology, because I mean the technology is well covered and now is pretty well understood. But he had this fascination with radio, and he was pretty much self-schooled, but experimented a lot in his parents' loft. And he was captured by the idea that you could, in the first place, it was just ringing a bell, create a spark, transmit a radio wave, and then receive it and use that to ring a bell. That went to obviously a Morse code reader. The tape inkers were a standard bit of kit from the cable industry. And he started with that, pushing the distances. And that again was Marconi's his sort of passion with refinement. So he moved his, receiver out of the loft into the garden, and he improved things and managed to get it to the end of the garden, eventually round the hill, and he could get a kilometre or more. And he was starting to, disprove some of the people that said it wouldn't go around corners. The fact that he managed to get a reception the other side of the hill. And there's various stories about him sending the gardener off with a 12-bore because he was out of sight in the trees, and the only way that Marconi could know that the signal had been received was the report of the 12 ball being fired in the trees. Eventually, as a young man, still as a quite young man, about 1895, this was going on. His mother took him and offered this. Marconi's magic box, basically, was, you know, what it was classed as in those days. Took this along to the post office in Italy, and they didn't have the imagination to realize quite what they were being shown. So with her great British origins, his mother took him to England. And again, through the introductions, through the family, he was introduced to William Preece, of one of the chief engineers in the British General Post Office, the GPO. And he was very interested in this himself and was carrying out experiments already in wireless telegraphy. Marconi did demonstrations, but one of the things, and one of the if you like, the geniuses of Marconi was that as a man with a passion, who was actually producing something that other people hadn't got to demonstrate at that time, he was capable of taking advice. And the advice that he was given by the Italian ambassador in London was, before you show anybody how this thing works, so basically don't open the box and show them what's inside it, get it patented. And obviously his mother, through family connections, took him to Henry Jameson Davis, who was his cousin, and they worked together and got patents out. Interestingly, the patents weren't for anything to do with the actual principles behind it. The patent was about the improvement of wireless telegraphy. So he didn't say, I've invented something, this is all my work. He said, but I've improved on it. And that's what his patent stood on. And that was the secret, really. That was the foundation of Marconi's success, because having got the patents in his name, through his family connections, they set up the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company, who immediately bought the patents from Marconi, bought the patent rights from him. So he's £15,000 in profit straight away there. £15,000 obviously being a lot of money in those days. And, you know, history was written from there. He was, through the company, associated with good business people. He had funding, he had backers behind him, and he took his product away and worked it up. Started off with demonstrations across Salisbury Plain to the military, then, you know, went from ultimately worked up Chelmsford to France, and the Isle of Wight, eventually down to Cornwall. And that had really started getting people to sit up and notice, because in those two distances, they both were interrupted by the curvature of the Earth. So it wasn't a straight line path. And all the academics of the time were saying these radio waves won't go follow the Earth's curvature. So you won't get over the horizon communication with these waves. Marconi didn't have the theoretical knowledge enough to be able to, you know, dispute that on paper or you know, with the science and the theory, but he was proving it through practice by making a better, more powerful transmitter, a more sensitive receiver, and so on. And the big step forward for him was this link from the Isle of Wight to the Lizard Point. And that brings us sort of up to where we are, talking about the Mullion. And hold on here, I'm trying to get this. Now we've got a problem. Oh, there we go. Right, it has gone on. Right. And this was where he got his interest in Cornwall. Now, unfortunately, this presentation was originally set up to be given in the village here in Mullion. This Mullion being the nearest village to the Poldhu site. So it's a bit sort of Cornwall centric, but hopefully you'll excuse me that. But the obviously the goings on around Poldhu are, you know, the big interest, because that was the Atlantic leap, and that was really, by the time he came down here, what was going to make him and what was going to make the company. Marconi came down with a couple of the other directors of this newly founded company to the Lizard for two reasons. One, he was looking to capitalize on his invention. By this time, they'd already seen a good revenue stream from communication with boats, either boats, ships to ship, or ship to shore communications. So the Marconi company were now making an apparatus that could be put into a ship and give them around about in excess of sort of 60-mile range, which was, you know, pretty useful by that time. He had been over to America and provided some communications for one of the big yacht races over there, so that the news media could get up-to-date reports from the actual yachts in the flotilla. They then also found another revenue stream, which was on the way home on the liner. They transmitted from the coast station, was on the Isle of Wight, to the liner, still sort of 60 miles out, and provided a newspaper so that the passengers, the wealthy passengers, could buy a newspaper with the up-to-date news before they actually landed at Southampton, which is a pretty revolutionary for the time. And his next step was that he wanted to set up a shore station at the Lizard Point, or near the Lizard Point, where there was a Lloyd's signal station. Now, Lloyd's provided a telegraph, an inland telegraph from London, from their headquarters down to the Lizard Point. And over the years, the incoming ships, mainly a lot of them being sailing ships, would come up to the headland there and signal with flags or with semaphore who they were, where they were from. That information would be passed up to London to the owners, who would then arrange berthing in Port of London or wherever, and that signal would be then transmitted back down on the telegraph and signaled by flags out to the ship. It worked very well, and there was obviously a commercial need for it. But the trouble was, if the southwesterly wind got up while the ships were off the Lizard Point, some of these old sailing ships would just ended up on the rocks and wrecked completely, because they couldn't get away from that lee shore. Marconi comes along and sees an opportunity. He can use the telegraph to London from the Lizard signal station, from Lloyd's signal station, and he can communicate by radio to the ships, which means they can stand off 30 or 40 or 50 miles in safety while they receive their orders. So that's one of the reasons he was down here, and that was in 1900 by this time, and he came down. But his second reason, which was still not made public at the time, he was looking for an experimental station to as close to North America as would practically be possible, to do the Atlantic leap, to do the great experiment, and to get signals across the Atlantic. At that time, the cable companies already had an established and working cable. They spent a lot of money on it, and there'd been a lot of failures, but so they were his arch rivals, and they were just across the bay, down at Porthcurno. So eventually Marconi found the field at Poldhu, and that's how he ended up there. There are other reasons, probably, because he located the Lizard station at Bass Point right next to an extremely good hotel, the Housel Bay Hotel. And Poldhu, he was completely adjacent neighbour to the Poldhu Hotel, which was another extremely good hotel. This slide here just shows some of the characters around at that time. Obviously, Marconi himself, this is a very young man with some of his very early equipment here, spark generator transmitter and a receiver. These were two of his colleagues. This gentleman with the more droopy moustache is Percy Paget. He did a lot of the work down at the Lizard Station and also worked at Poldhu. And this is George Kemp. Kemp's was Marconi's assistant. So he wasn't a scientist or a radio engineer. He was actually from he'd spent time in the Royal Navy, but he worked for the General Post Office for Preece, the chief engineer, and he'd been loaned originally to Marconi to assist him, but they established a good relationship, and actually George Kemp moved across the Marconi company and spent the rest of his working life with Marconi. These were the three people who went over to Newfoundland for the original tests, and it was Marconi who heard the 3 dots of the signal, and that was confirmed by Kemp. And we're not too sure where Paget was because he was over there. Some reports say that he tried to hear it and couldn't because his hearing wasn't very good. Other reports said he wasn't well on that day. But it was basically Kemp and Marconi who verified the signals. I don't know whether this we've got this. I've got a. I don't know if everyone else can see that. This is just an amusing little picture here. We know this is just off bottom right-hand side. This is just off Poldhu, and they're doing some radio tests from the Poldhu station. There's Marconi here, obviously has hired some sort of small boat. And here's George Kemp, the ever faithful assistant, who was known to be seasick, terribly seasick. He's striving on with the work here. He's got a pair of headphones on his head, but he doesn't look the happiest man in the world. And I think that's a good indication of the sort of faithful work that they were doing. Okay, so they built the Poldhu radio station. Now Marconi was really just going for something bigger and more powerful. This was the most powerful radio transmitter in the world. This mast array here was 200-foot high masts. There were 20 of them, and they were in a 200-foot radius circle. I think really all they were trying to do was get as much copper up in the air as possible. They had discovered, or they had the ability to tune the signals so that they could, for instance, operate from the Lizard Point, the Bass Point, and from Poldhu at the same time. And this syntonic tuning was part of Marconi's famous 7777 patent. Again, develop something, patent it quick. There's a little paper cutting here. This is really to show, to imagine building something like this in a world where putting up a 5G telephone mast is a huge problem. This was built from the early parts of 1901 and was completed in September 1901. Unfortunately, it fell down. There was a gale of wind, and Nick, is this panel I've got, is that in the way of everyone else seeing the pictures?
Not at all. No, we can see the pictures absolutely clear.
You can see. Oh, right. I've got a panel with my view on there as well coming up. Okay, that's good. You can see them all. So yeah, you can see the destruction. Those masts fell down in early September. Within a month, they had jury-rigged this antenna, which was just a fan antenna. And the transmitter hut was in here. Now, again, Marconi, one of his very good things was being able to use other people's skills and working with people and choosing the right people as well. It was said that he was very quick to sort of fire anybody who he didn't feel was up to the standard he wanted. But we have here the actual transmitter room here, the hall, is directly beneath the antenna because they had no feeder arrangement. So basically the antenna connected straight to what was then called a jigger, which was a matching transformer basically. And then that was energized straight away by the spark. So at this stage, they hadn't got any feeder arrangements at all. They just hadn't been developed. The little paper cutting here just shows, you know, this was actually accepted very well by the local community. They were very happy to have Marconi. He brought a lot of work. Obviously, this all had to be worked by the local people. And of course, then those people stayed in the village and the hotels and brought wealth into the area. So everyone was quite happy there. Just a note that obviously after this antenna fell down, they built an identical one at South Wellfleet near Boston in the USA. And shortly after this one fell down, within a month or so, that one fell down as well. So I think the problem was they didn't appear to have any sort of diagonal radial bracing on the thing. And I think it just twisted and collapsed, which it looks rather like. Caught a gust of wind. But by this time, Marconi really had staked the company on the success of this, because he borrowed from the Marconi company. It was by then called the Marconi Radio Telegraphy Company. He had borrowed £50,000 for this experiment. Now, £50,000 was millions of pounds worth of investment, and they had invested that much money in an experiment. And it's a tribute to Marconi's tenacity, which is another sort of quality shown through his life, that he continued with this. But they had decided by this time they probably weren't going to be able to get as far as South Wellfleet, and even this was before it fell down. And they would go to St. John's in Newfoundland, and they packed on the steamer, the liner that they went on, helium, balloons, kites, and you know, large amount of aerial wire, and fairly portable equipment. So Marconi really had staked the company on this. If this 3 dots hadn't got across the North Atlantic, that would be close of play for them, and it would have been left to somebody else to develop the technology. This is just a quick a snapshot of some of the equipment. This is the generator and the alternator producing 2,000 volts. It was stepped up to 20,000 volts. This is one of the later arcs. This isn't the one that was used in the earliest transmissions. And then you've got banks of they called them Leyden jars. They were capacitors, and there's not shown here. There was the jigger coils, the large inductors, and you can just see down here it says something like caution, very dangerous, stand clear. The voltages they were using, and possibly the unknown effects of the RF, this was a bit of an understatement, really. And but there is no record of anybody having actually been killed on this site, which is quite reassuring. Okay, this is a quick. We'll fly over this one. This one's more for the village, but you can see it's just an indication of the sort of employment this was offering. These lattice masts you can see in the background here were put up in 1902. This was sort of the next generation of masts that went up there. And within here, I guess, yeah, there's a lot of the old faces, seamen's hats and all sorts here. So it had gathered a lot of people in. Okay. Another quick historical perspective is the transportation. When Marconi came here in 1900, this is the hotel over on this side here. These are the later masts, the 1902, 1903 masts, and they've been decorated for the royal visit. But you can see the hotel. This hotel was built and owned by the Great Western Railway. And as the railways companies in all parts of the world, I believe, they built hotels to provide destinations for their passengers. And you could buy your ticket in Paddington Station in London for your stay on the Cornish Riviera at the Poldhu Hotel. It certainly wasn't for the ordinary people of this world. They were sort of, a very wealthy clientele that went there. But you can see that Marconi's built his radio station right next to it. He had rooms booked in the hotel, which were for his sole use, which he used for some experimentation and obviously to stay when he was visiting the site. But the era we're in, Marconi has brought this technology down here to a quiet, basically farming and fishing community. There had been a bit of mining, but that had sort of petered out or was, not doing well by then. So it was a very rural, very isolated area. Marconi turns up with something which is akin to black magic, really, to most people. It was totally inexplicable what he was doing or how it worked. And on the sort of transport front, I was just trying to highlight there, this is the Helston railway station. So you got your train ticket on a steam train down to Helston railway station, which was about sort of 7 or 8 miles up the road. And you came the last bit. The Great Western Railway had their own horse omnibus. So this is here is one of their horse omnibuses. And in 1900, when Marconi first came here, that was how the guests got out to the hotel, by horsepower. So contrast of the sort of technologies and the era that it was in. Another quick set of slides here. This was more for our village. The sort of interest that Marconi was starting to create. This was a visit by the then Prince of Wales to the Marconi station. This was the king who was later to become George V of England. I say that for the international. I'm basing this. We've got an international audience, so yeah. And this was obviously a very big day for the area, for the village. And Marconi brought royalty down. This is the 2 cars, one with Marconi, one with royalty in, entering the village of Marconi. And you can see how everybody's turned out in their very best. The whole of the village was apparently decked with bunting and flags. This was for a 2-hour visit, but you can see how important it was. There was a lovely story which I sort of told for the local audience, but these towers here, they had platforms, and there was a step walkway. So the prince, who himself was actually very interested in radio and could read Morse. He had been taught Morse. It was a skill that he had. So he wanted to go to the top of the tower, and he was taken up there. Because of the day, Marconi had dressed up all his workers in this sort of pseudo sailor suits. So they were all dressed in uniform, very smart. And on the North Tower, which would have been this one here, that the royal party was taken up, they had stationed an employee on each of the platforms, but they were told that they were under no accounts to speak to the royal party unless they were spoken to. And there's a tale of a Mr. Exelby from the village who was on the lower platform. And the princess, as you can see, there's sunshine shadows there that day. It was obviously a nice warm day. She's got a very formal and quite hot dress. But so she got up to the first platform and announced that she wasn't going any further. She was too hot. And Mr. Exelby apparently said to her, "Don't you worry, my dear. You just sit down here with me and I'll keep you company." And it's a tale told in the village still. The Cornish are very proud of their hospitality, and apparently she did. And they were, yeah, a very successful visit. But Marconi had, again, the contacts he had already provided some telegraph connection for Queen Victoria. So he's mixing in very much the right circles to forward his aims. Now we jump to another area of Marconi's life here, which was he was I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to be polite, really. He was noted as a bit of a womanizer. He had various love affairs and infatuations and scandals in his life, in his lifetime. The first picture on the top left there, that's Marconi. I think he's 5 or 6 in that picture, and his mother. She was very much. She looked after him. She brought him to England. I mean, he was then in his early 20s. She stayed in Poole in a hotel a lot of the time, and there are letters saying, you've gone to Poldhu and you've left your blanket or your rug behind, and I don't want you getting cold in your bed at night, so I've sent it on to you. So you're very much a sort of very caring, doting mother. He had a couple of engagements where he was obviously by this time in the early sort of 1902, 1903. He was traveling across the Atlantic on liners fairly regularly. And on a couple of occasions, he boarded the liner without a fiancée and got off at the other end with one. There was a couple of, Josephine Holman was one noted, and Inez Mulholland. Both ladies of standard. Quite interestingly, though, both ladies who were quite, Inez Mulholland was a suffragette. Obviously, that was quite a thing in those days. They were women who knew their own minds, and that's the sort of person that he was associating with in those times. He eventually married this lady on the bottom left-hand side, Beatrice, and she was again from a fairly aristocratic family from Northern Ireland. I believe her father was a baron, and they had, in fact, in total 4 children together, one of whom sadly died. And that sort of introduced some of the tragedy into Marconi's life. On this particular occasion, he'd rushed back from Poldhu. He tried to bring Beatrice down to Poldhu, but she really hadn't settled in. She said she didn't like the food, and the hotel was sort of cold and inhospitable. And he'd moved her back to London. She was also pregnant as well at that time. And Marconi being in Cornwall, Beatrice in London, he wasn't there for the birth. And sadly, the child died at about the age of 3 or 4 weeks with an infection, as I guess, happened in those days. Marconi rushed up to London, obviously to be with his wife, and was faced with this sort of terrible sadness of a child. And there's stories of him driving around London, trying to find a cemetery to bury the child in, because of course the child hadn't been baptized, and that was an issue. He then fell ill, which was, unfortunately, he had malaria through his life, and at times of high stress, this flared up. So faced with this absolutely, unbearable situation, he then gets ill with malaria, and this was a sort of slightly recurrent theme through. Sadly, his relationship with Beatrice, they had 4 children together, but he spent so much time with his passion of radio, and also he was traveling the world. He was doing a lot of experimentation in boats and things like that. By 1912, they had started talking about separating. The relationship wasn't going well, and Marconi was unfortunately noted as a womanizer, but I'd say to some extent in his defense, given his position, which was he was very wealthy. He was by this time famous, and he was very handsome. He was quite a catch for any lady looking for a husband, and indeed quite a catch for any mother looking for a husband for her daughter as well. So, you know, he would have had a lot of ladies approaching him as much as he might have approached them. 19 that was sort of 1912 was also a sad year for him. He lost the sight of one eye. One of his other passions was motor cars, and he was involved in a motor accident in Italy with Beatrice as well. And in this accident, he lost the sight of an eye. So Marconi then carried on for the rest of his life with a glass eye, Murano glass, made in Italy in Venice. Apparently, it was a very good eye that was very difficult to tell it was glass. But so that was a sort of another sadness was piling on. And also in that year, there was also a scandal. And I think this was significant because there was a insider dealing and corruption scandal with the Marconi company, between the Marconi company. It involved the very highest people in the British government, and also the head of the post office. And it was all around. Marconi shares had just been floated in America. They were doing very well. There was a deal had been struck with the post office, which would involve the what was known as the Imperial Relay Scheme. And this was setting up large transmitters to communicate with South Africa was one, Australia, and India, for instance. So this is providing communications for the then empire. And that needed ratification by government. There was the corruption charges were that there was no tender bid for this, but you know there weren't any other companies that were capable of submitting a tender anyway. And then there was this sale of shares to, I believe, the Prime Minister of the time from the company chairman. And Marconi, it didn't touch Marconi at all. He, apart from his name. But this, I feel that Marconi was starting to feel that, you know, he wasn't quite so welcome in England as he'd been made in the early stages. Going back to his marriage to Beatrice, this eventually failed in early 1920s, and he was divorced from her. And then we had this scandalous thing. The centre picture in here is a lady called Betty Painter, who lived with her father, Colonel Painter, in an old manor house down just the other side of Penzance. So you're talking about 15 miles away from Poldhu or thereabouts. And Marconi started spending time down there. It was very much it appeared to be a sort of a bit of an open house. There was quite a lot of notable people there in the arts community. There's an author, Mary Wesley, wrote a book called Chamomile Lawn, which is supposed to be the fictional account of what went on at Boskenna, very much a party scene. Anyway, Marconi was going down there, and he formed a relationship with Betty Painter. Now, Marconi in this picture is 52 years old. Betty Painter is 17. And there was, it hit the media. It was quite a scandal. It went on for a while. Marconi actually took her on a cruise by then he had his ship, the Electra. He cruised the Mediterranean with her, but her father said that there was no way she was going on her own. So he sent her mother along as well. So her mother Ethel went with him as well. And that then started the rumour mongers that actually it was his mother that the relationship was with. But it petered out. It was probably a fling. Interesting that Marconi, again, it's sort of the human side of him. He would quite often disclose to his wife, Beatrice, his first wife, that he was lonely. And it was said of him that he had a lot of male acquaintances, but possibly not many real friends. And those acquaintances went all the way from kings downwards. So, you know, as an interesting and difficult relationship. And just to sort of conclude the picture here, the bottom right-hand side, this is Marconi's second wife, Christina. And you can see by this picture, he's becoming a more elderly man. And you know, again, when they married, there was quite a large age difference between the two. But they seem to be very happy, seem to be very much in love. Some of their love letters have been published by Christina himself, and they are really gushing. They're sort of more letters you would associate with a young lover than a more elderly one. So that's yeah, Marconi, and I think, you know, some of the ladies in his life. Quick move on here to his ship, which was his floating laboratory and his home for a long time. He very much used this. Again, it became a bit of a party ship. He used it genuinely for a lot of experimentation, particularly from Poldhu with the beam system when they were using Fleming, who's Franklin was developing the beam system, which came, the original efforts to sell the beam before the First World War, that petered out. It never really happened. But then it became the Empire beam system after, by which time they had increased the frequencies. They were into the shortwave band then, and they were getting far better results in terms of propagation. And they were starting to understand the propagation by reflection from the ionosphere, which is something they didn't understand properly or acknowledge, the people who said it might be happening, until the early 20s. So this was the Electra, his boat. It was built for Archduke Ferdinand in about 1904 for the Austrian dynasty. And it went through a couple of owners. It served as a boat in the First World War with the Royal Navy, impressed it as a minesweeper in the North Sea. And Marconi bought this ship after the First World War from the Admiralty for £19,000 at auction, and had it refitted with his radio rooms. He then went to use that for the rest of his life. It went to the Italian government, or more or less the Italian Navy, in the Second World War, and then was commandeered by the Germans, who used it in the Adriatic. They fitted it out with a gun, apparently. It was used in the Adriatic and eventually was sunk by the Allies on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea. Unfortunately, they did make some efforts to try and recover it. Some of its bits are still around. I believe the bow section has been taken back to Marconi's family home, the Villa Grifoni. The only interesting point to note about this is that a lot of people name their boats after their daughters. Marconi named his daughter of his second marriage, Electra. So she is Princess Electra Marconi, named after the boat. The latter years of Marconi's life, we've seen there was some sort of disaffection from Britain, perhaps, perception by Marconi. And from the very beginnings, when Marconi started rising to fame, the Italians, to a great extent, wanted him back. And he was given a lot of honours. He became a senator. He became a marquess. So he was given a lot of dignification there, and he mixed in the very highest circles. one of the things that had made Marconi really famous was the Titanic disaster. That really put him on the world stage. Probably, made him one of the most famous people in the whole of the world. And it was because of Marconi's wireless equipment that was fitted to the Titanic that it was able to put out a distress message. And obviously the Carpathia picked that up and was there within about an hour and a half. Marconi, one of the lucky aspects of his life, had been offered tickets for himself and his family on the Titanic on that maiden voyage, because again, he's a famous person. They wanted the famous people to be on board. But due to work pressures, he'd gone across on the Lusitania 3 days earlier, which placed him in New York when the tragedy happened. And he became credited personally with having saved those 706 people who were recovered from the Titanic, because undoubtedly without Marconi, without his radio equipment on the Titanic, they would have been looking for the boat for well into the future, and we'd probably still been arguing about what had happened and how it had sunk. So he, that put him on the world stage. Of some of the pictures here, bottom left-hand side, we have Marconi. Now, he's pretty much living in Italy now. This is from about sort of mid-20s, 1920s onwards. He's over in Italy. You can see he's been awarded a great many, he was getting honorary degrees and awards. He was knighted in England. He was, everybody wanted Marconi to be their sort of champion, if you like. So he's mixing in very high circles. The guy up the top here, not all that pleased on putting him up. This is Mussolini, who obviously went on to notoriety as a despot. Not the sort of person you really want perhaps to be involved with, but in some defense of Marconi, in the early days, in the mid-20s, Marconi was actually more famous than Mussolini. Mussolini needed him as a friend more than Marconi needed Mussolini. And interestingly, his in later years, his daughter, Elettra, said that Marconi actually hated Mussolini, but he was a member of the fascist party. He was strongly nationalistic. Now, whether this, the big argument still goes on, whether this was, whether he was a fascist through conviction or convenience, because basically they were the people he had to sell all his radio equipment to. This gentleman down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor down there, lower down, that is the King of Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III. He had associations with Marconi, again, from the very early days. He lent Marconi his cruiser to go and do experiments from in 1902. There was an interesting gentleman called Solari, Luigi Solari, who's an Italian. He was a developer of a coherer, one of the coherers, the Italian Navy coherer. So he was a scientist in his own right, and he came to work for Marconi, the Marconi company, at a very early stage. But he seemed to be very much the sort of Italian fixer. He was associated through fairly noble birth with the king, and he was doing a lot for Marconi in Italy. This gentleman here, the third one from the left at the bottom, wearing a sash, that's Marconi's father-in-law of his second marriage. He is high up in the Vatican. He's known as the Black Nobility. They were a nobility to protect the Vatican. So you can see again, high-born in that area. And this at the top here, in the middle here, this rather unassuming gentleman here in the white coat is actually Pope Pius XI. and one of his cardinals sitting behind him. And here Marconi is inaugurating Vatican Radio, the worldwide broadcasting system, which of course he'd sold them. So you can see that very much this argument about, well, if he wasn't a fascist, he wouldn't have been doing business at this level in Italy at this time. And it's also, I mean, there's a quote from his second wife who said that, you know, Marconi was very concerned about the state of the world and what fascism was bringing it to, and had actually counselled Mussolini on staying clear of the coming conflict of the Second World War, and not to antagonise Britain or France, because it would only bring in America. That may have been said with hindsight, but it's definitely said by his wife Christina. And this is Christina at the top here, and she's Princess Electra. Sorry, I've got the box in the way. No, sorry, this is Christina on the right here, his second wife at the top. And the bottom here, we have Marconi, looking quite an old man at this time. This is his daughter. This is Electra. And this must have been taken very, very shortly before he died in 1937. He actually died on Electra's seventh birthday. So she was old enough to remember him. And sort of a sad occasion, but he had suffered, as we said, with malaria. He latterly had heart problems. He'd had 8 heart attacks before the 9th, which was the one that finally killed him. So that was 1937. He was again high up in Italy. He was given a funeral, a state funeral, where they say that 500,000 people, 500,000 people turned out and lined the route through Rome, an absolutely massive procession. There was also the radio silence of all his radio stations around the world. And here we have, we mentioned it before, the Villa Grifoni. This is where Marconi grew up, still owned by his family. And beneath it is the mausoleum, which was built by, sadly, again, the association was built on the request of Mussolini. This is where Marconi and his second wife remain today. And that's a museum, and there is, it can be visited. They also named the local village Sasso Marconi after him. It was renamed after his death. And finally, this monument here stands on the cliff at Poldhu, just south of the radio station, or the field where the radio station was. At the moment, there is no building standing from the original structures, but which is quite fortunate for memorial sake. The foundations are still there. So the bases of the antennas, or the later antennas, are there. The foundations of the transmitter hall are there. So you can get some sort of feeling of the layout of the place. And this monument was placed not only as just a memorial to Marconi, but the people who worked at the site at Poldhu, and the work that they completed there. And you can see it's a rather nice location on the cliff there. The top of it, we always the kids all say it's the Batman symbol on the top, but actually this shape at the top, you can't quite see it's from one side, but it is an M for Marconi straddling the globe, and providing two sort of look-alike antennas above the surface of the Earth. It's in quite detail if you get up to it. The continents of the globe are actually carved into the granite. And I say there are bronze plaques at the bottom which explain what it is and why it's there. So that's quite a significant memorial, and it's something that we like to go and have a look at occasionally. Okay, so that rounds it up really. Like I say, with Marconi's 150th anniversary of his birth tomorrow, we're opening the centre up. We're hoping, as we do normally, to get some 20-metre links across the North Atlantic to the radio clubs in Newfoundland and down in Cape Cod, to sites that were both became, well, sorry, Newfoundland didn't become a Marconi station in the end. That went down to Nova Scotia, but it was Nova Scotia, Glace Bay, and Cape Cod were the two big stations for Canada and America, respectively. And we're also hoping to get a link up to the Italian Radio Society down at Villa Grifoni. They will be having a radio station down there. And we were hoping, but I'm not too sure whether it's going to be possible, that Princess Electra was going to be down at Villa Grifoni and actually also speaking on the radio. But I'm not too sure. The things I've heard, I'm not too sure she's going to make it now. That's our day. We'll open up our visitor centre and continue to tell the story of Marconi and the great Atlantic leap that he performed from Poldhu, and the man who changed the world. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. That was a fascinating presentation, and I hope everyone else got as much pleasure from it as I did. Can I just check before I forget, but the International Marconi Day stations are going on the air on Saturday and Friday, or just Friday?
No, tomorrow, Thursday, will be the celebration of his birthday.
Yep.
Which won't be quite such a widespread thing as International Marconi Day, and that will be on Saturday. Okay. So International Marconi Day will go ahead. We'll be trying to make the same contacts then, but also that opens up to amateur radio clubs who set up on as many Marconi sites as possible, where he's had radio stations or factories or contact with the area. So that's puts a bit more of a competitive element in it to actually get as many contacts with Marconi sites as possible. So yes, that's the International Marconi Day. That happens every year on the Saturday nearest to the 25th of April.
And will you be using the Poldhu Amateur Radio Club call sign, which I believe is GB2GM?
Yes, we will. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Golf Bravo to Guglielmo Marconi. Or William, as he sometimes signed himself in England.
Okay, thank you very much, James. No, that was really good, and really enjoyed that talk. And I know I've had a couple of comments from people watching it on YouTube, which just typed in the chat here saying that's been a great talk. Thank you very much. So I'm going to open it up really to questions and any comments people have got from the floor about Marconi that people want to know about. So who wants to go first? Everyone's gone very quiet.
I have a couple of comments. First of all, I don't know if you can see it, but that last photo that you showed me, that's me in front of that statue.
Ah, marvelous. And it's a lovely, significant monument, isn't it?
It certainly is. It certainly is. That is one of the most beautiful areas that I've ever been in around Cornwall there. It's been several years since I was there, and I did operate from the station. I also used to operate, and I forget the fellow's name, the fellow used to operate from Lizard on a regular basis next to the hotel.
Yeah,
And
well, there is the hut is still there from the Bass Point radio station, and they've got it as a visitor centre. So that's manned by various of the local amateurs on the rota.
yeah, of course,
Like us, they're telling a slightly different. They're telling the story of the ship to shore radio station there. We're telling the story of the experimental station at Poldhu.
yeah, I haven't heard anyone from Cornwall recently. Conditions just haven't been there for me. But when I look through my scrapbook, I have quite a few contacts with that area. And what surprised me, it's been several years. I think I took the bus to Plymouth, or the train to Plymouth,
Yeah.
and then I took a bus. And when I got off the bus, I had to walk down that hill past what I would presume is a big hotel or a home to get to your station there at Poldhu, the one that was built in 2002.
Yeah, yeah. That hotel, that was the Poldhu Hotel. It is now an old people's home. But it was, a grand hotel in its day.
That was the
That's what
hotel.
you would have seen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right next door was, the radio station.
And the last question or comment that I have, that the circular antenna that you showed me, I wonder if that's where Woolenweber got his idea for his antenna.
I mean, I guess that was the thinking at the time.
Yeah.
Again, you've got this problem. You haven't got feeders, so you've got to build the antenna around the transmitter hall, and that was a cone of cable. I forget how many wires going down. Obviously, there were 20 of the actual. They used nautical terminology. They were gallants and top gallants that they used to build those masts up. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that sort of a cone funnel of pattern of wire was the what was expected to be the very best performance in an antenna in those days.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting when I saw that. The first thing I thought of was a Woolenweber.
But the interesting thing is that there's reports there that when it was operating, there was just so much sort of static electricity and from the actual thing that everything metal would tick and spark. And there's one report I've got there that says that if you dropped a bunch of keys on the ground near the transmitter hall, if you reached down to pick them up, you could draw sparks from your fingertips to the metal of the keys. The field strengths they were generating there were probably pretty frightening, because the sensitivity of the receivers with those coherers wasn't very good. So they were obviously radiating quite a lot of power.
Yeah. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Anyone else with a question or comment? Yeah, Stephen. Yeah, Stephen, you have to unmute. Need to unmute, Stephen.
Sorry. I've been over. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Good. Okay. I've had a problem because I got locked out for 15 minutes just now, from 10 past 8 to 20 past, and had to restart the computer. I don't know why, but it happens. So I missed a bit of your talk. I'm sorry about that. We've been down to Poldhu on a couple of occasions, and sometimes it's open, but mainly at weekends, I think, rather than during the week. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, our big problem is the number of us volunteering. At the moment, we're guaranteed to be open on a Sunday afternoon from 1:30 till 4:30.
That's right. Yeah.
We are hoping to get onto our summer opening in a month or so's time, which will be Wednesday afternoon as well. And then we do Thursday in the peak of the season. But that's very much dependent on getting people to man it, because unfortunately opening during the week, it sort of puts out people with real jobs, and it's down to us old retired guys who can creep away from home for the afternoon. So yeah, that is always our problem, but we do try and make people welcome. And if somebody's down and they've got a special request for a particular day, we'll do our best to get somebody in and open it up for them, especially if they're licensed.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
Anyone else with a comment or question to James?
Yeah.
Yes, Terry. You have to unmute, Terry.
Good afternoon, everybody. James, thanks very much for a excellent talk. That was a lot of things I did not know about Marconi, so you've enlightened me.
Yeah, indeed.
I haven't had the chance to be at Poldhu, but I have been to the Wellfleet, Massachusetts site where one of his stations was. And just by chance, I'm wearing my Cape Cod sweatshirt today.
Oh, marvelous.
The site at Wellfleet, well, it's been over 50 years since I've been there. But as I remember, there was only one concrete pad left on the hilltop where the mast had been, and the others have been washed away by the sea from erosion over the years, because it looks right over the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
But it's still a memorable place, and I was glad to have been able to go there. Thanks again, James.
There's a great feeling of history in these places, really, and we're lucky that there is, so many bits of concrete left in the ground, because actually the Marconi company were told that they had to clear the site back to farmland, and they took the antennas down and the buildings and never got quite round to removing the foundations, which is quite nice, because you can see what the especially their beam antennas. They had 6 very tall masts there in the later years. They also had they experimented with the first coaxial cable feed. They had offset from the transmitter hall. They had an underground feed. I believe it was quite a big pipe. I don't think it was a cable as such. It was certainly by the amount of hole in the ground that has been recovered. So we haven't got any record of that. But that was the first feed, and it was taken to a directional beam antenna that they could actually rotate. It was on a railway track. So they were experimenting with all sorts of things. So the station itself hardly stayed in one configuration over the whole time it was there. And it was pressed into military service in the First World War. That was taken over by the military and used for ship-to-shore communication, and wasn't closed until 1933. Was the actual station was closed, and they finished all the experimentation there. Things had moved on a lot, and obviously Marconi company was into all sorts of interesting things, like radar and all those sort of the developments that went on, especially with the higher frequencies.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk.
Good.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else with a question or comment to James? I mean, yeah, go on, Roger.
Hi, James. Thank you. It was really interesting. And I see the Italians were quick to change the name of the village. I wonder if that's any pressure down there in Cornwall to change the name of the places and to get a bit more recognition in the wider world, because we might have heard of Poldhu, but everybody's heard of Marconi.
Yes. I don't think that's ever been. I mean, we get the odd name of businesses pops up. We had when I came to the village years back, there was a Marconi guest house. That changed its name to something bizarre, the Ridgeback or something, which I never got that one properly. But no, we haven't hung on to that to some extent. I suppose maybe they're just proud of the name Poldhu and the associations there. But we should probably exploit Marconi. Certainly, if you go to most other parts of the world, certainly in North America, every time you drive into a town, they have a big sign that says "Home of,"
Yes.
And we ought to have a big sign that says "Home of Marconi."
Yeah, well, at least a street.
Yeah.
So there's an idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you. Interesting. Thank you.
I'll have a word with the parish council.
Right.
Yeah,
don't expect too much.
having lived and worked in Essex, James, when you drive into Chelmsford in Essex, where Marconi had a very big factory,
Yeah.
you see a big sign saying, welcome to Chelmsford, the home of radio.
Yeah.
Because of Marconi. And in fact, in the run up to this meeting, I got contacted by a number of radio amateurs from Essex who worked in the Marconi factories in Chelmsford, just to express an interest in your talk and catching up with us as well later in the week.
Yeah.
So it's, as you say, the name Marconi resonates. I mean, probably I can't be the only person in the room who was a young boy. His first ever commercial radio, shortwave radio I had, was the Marconi CR100 that weighed about 200 tons.
Yeah.
I remember. And the only thing I had to put in it was I had to fit a BFO into it so I could listen to CW, and of course the growing number of SSB stations as well. But yeah, so obviously Marconi was an incredibly successful businessman, and you've kind of said that all the way through your presentation there. Managing to make an awful lot of money out of what he was up to.
Oh, they worked quite hard. I mean, the Marconi company didn't actually pay its shareholders a dividend until 1908. That was so they were struggling until then to get the communications and the flow of money, if you like, coming in. So they were working hard at it. But going back to what you're saying about Chelmsford, it really is amazing the number of people who come into our visitor centre who say, I used to work for Marconi, my father worked for Marconi, my uncle worked for Marconi. Yeah. There was such a big employer around. And we jokingly say that somebody ought to get a smartphone app which tells you how far away you are from the nearest Marconi site in the country. And I think you probably find most of the time you're within 10 miles of one. There was so many radio stations and old radar stations, which are long gone now, and things like that. But when you do start plotting on a map, it's just amazing. Navigation beacons that they put up. There's a balloon site, the First World War balloon site, not far from Mullion. And Marconi was putting spark transmitters into hydrogen dirigible balloons. It seems like a bit of a perilous occupation. But he developed some crude navigation systems. And there was a bit further down the road, he built or Marconi company had built effectively a non-directional beacon, just a radio beacon. And these dirigible ships were going out into the western approaches, plotting submarines and hopefully dropping small bombs on them. And they found their way back in those sort of early days of the First World War. They were using radio for navigation. So that immediately put, a couple of X's on the map of where Marconi had been, and the Marconi company had left their mark.
I was very much struck, James, by your comment in that presentation there when you first put up that huge antenna, the 200-foot mast in that enormous circle of wire that went up there. And we're talking just at the turn of the century, aren't we? And as you said, it must have felt to local people this was something completely out of the world. I mean, those of us in this room of my age and older, I mean, I grew up as a young boy in the 1960s. It was when my interest was peaked in radio. And even then, the fact that I could have this little radio, or relatively small those days valve radios, but a valve radio and a piece of wire in the back garden, and could talk to people elsewhere in the world using this thing called radio with other countries was just amazing. It was just like something fantastic. Now, of course, for people of my children and grandchildren's generation, with the computer and the internet and mobile phones and the telecommunications worldwide industry we've got, this is kind of, nothing new in this at all. But if it was like that for us in the 1950s or 60s, or even 70s, how must it have been perceived by those people down in Cornwall, in Mullion, in 1900? It must have been absolutely amazing for them.
Well, they said that you could hear the ark 1.5 miles away. when they were flashing out the dots for the S's, for the S that they transmitted. And you've also got, on the other hand, you've got people like Conan Doyle who are proposing that this new form of radio can be used to communicate with the dead, because he was a very strong spiritualist. So you've also got, it's complete science fiction. And you've got sort of H.G. Wells writing outlandish stories at the same time. So what was going through people's minds? And, that's why I'm sort of thinking, I can't find any vicars preaching against this or anything like that at the time. It was totally accepted as, there's this marvelous technology coming along with this interesting Italian gentleman who he integrated with the village very well. I mean, there's lots of stories of him, playing cricket. They invited him to play cricket with a local cricket team. Sort of, that seemed to be a bit out of the scope for Italians, but and he joined in. So, he was certainly in those early days when he was down there, the first few years when he was regularly down there, he was, part of the community.
Yeah. And so it also explains, doesn't it, when you were saying about people's comments about the Titanic going down and Marconi, the kind of claims that Marconi saved 700 plus people through that. I mean, you can imagine across the entire planet in newspapers, because this is pre-television and the 24-hour media we've got, but in published newspapers, Marconi's name must have featured in virtually every country on the planet. And Terry and Bob from the States here this evening both have made the trip down to Poldhu to see where that first transatlantic leap took place in 1903, was it?
1901.
1901
was December.
Yeah.
12th of December
1901. So, you can understand now, looking back on it historically, 120 odd years later, that how a bigger figure he was around the world.
Yeah. I was trying to sort of, in my mind, sort of put him in perspective with other characters at the time. And, there's probably more people in the world had heard of him than the King of England or any royal head of a royal family, because there's lots of parts of the world where, they wouldn't be known. You start looking, perhaps the Pope would be known by more people in the world in those days than Marconi. But you struggle to think, because, like you say, I mean, he was a superstar, like a rock superstar of his day. Everybody knew who he was.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good comparison, isn't it? He's the John Lennon of of 1900. But no, good. Well, fascinating talk. Before we kind of move on, has anyone else got a chance for a question or comment to James?
I'll just add that the name lives on because. Hang on. There you go. There you go. Can you read?
Marconi Instruments Limited. We've one of our viewers tonight from Essex, Martin, just made the point he used to work for Marconi Avionics, as it was called. So there's a few people around. Just before you go, James, and just to whet people's appetite as well, looking at the kind of, I mean, I don't. Hopefully, I'm not alone in thinking that the history of how we're here playing with radio and Marconi features in a big way in terms of making it into a business and therefore into houses and workplaces around the world. But in a few weeks' time, on the 10th of July, I'll just show people the link to it. We've got this will probably be of even greater interest to direct interest to amateur radio operators. This particular guy here, Gerald Marcuse, G2NM, David Fry, G4JSZ, has written a book about Gerald Marcuse, describing him as the pioneer of radio. That's G2NM Shack.
Yeah.
And there's a few of us in this room who can probably say, my shack doesn't look terribly different from that now. But a fascinating man who, just to give you a little snippet of it, I think in 1927, to the absolute fury of the BBC, which was already operating by then, set up an empire radio station, and he claimed it to be the communications between Britain and the Empire, and set this radio transmitter up, and that was set up by this guy G2NM. So we've got to talk about him. And he was the secretary of the Radio Society of Great Britain, the transmitting and receiving part of the RSGB, so the bit that became the RSGB we know today. And he was also the representative. He was described as the general manager of the Amateur Radio Relay League in Britain. So Gerald Marcuse, that guy I showed you in that picture, is definitely one of the founders of the amateur radio movement in Great Britain. So we've got not him, of course. We've got David G4JSZ, who's published a book. It's available in paperback if anyone's interested. Really interesting book. Some lovely pictures in this as well, and he's coming to talk on the 10th of July. So James, I'm hoping. I mean, you followed on, because I think I mentioned to you when I was talking to you last week prior to going out tonight, that we had a couple of talks in our early Zoom days about 3 years ago, the beginning of the pandemic, from a radio amateur in Canada, who's written a book about the radio on the Titanic, and that was equally fascinating. So you've linked us very neatly to the talk we had on the Titanic, and then we're feeding in a couple of months' time to a talk about a genuine amateur radio enthusiast operating in Britain, who obviously is one of the pioneers of amateur radio here as well. So I can't be alone in still, I watched the video of Mike. I remember DO1BJW out next to the sea a couple of weeks ago with his Elecraft radio with a short portable whip on the top of it, talking to people across the world with these radio waves that we can't see, that scientists can describe to us and physicists can tell us what's actually going on. But there is Mike on this tiny device talking to these people hundreds and hundreds of miles away, which is what all of us do for a hobby. It still fascinates me, and that's why I think your talk was so interesting tonight, James.
Well, I just leave you with on the amateur radio aspect, that the amateurs actually drove Marconi, and not just the other way, because in the early days they were using very low frequencies, the long wave effectively, and sort of part of the medium wave band, and they were going to higher powers and lower frequencies. And when they were proposing the imperial relay scheme before the First World War, that's where they were, and everybody in the radio industry thought that was the way to go. And the amateurs were pretty much given all the higher frequencies in the shortwave bands.
Yeah.
And it took off very big, particularly in North America, but also in this country. And all of a sudden, people started noticing, or the Marconis of the world started noticing, that these amateurs were doing really quite incredible things. And because they still didn't understand the reflection of the ionosphere, that was still in the early 20s, a bit of a mystery. And the proposal, when Marconi started working with higher frequencies, the actual proposal for the Empire beam system had been moved up into the shortwave bands by that time. So, it was a realization of the work that the amateurs were doing. It was also quite funny that a gentleman called, I believe it's Oliver Heaviside, in 1902 postulated the theory that these radio waves were propagating over the horizon by bouncing off the ionosphere, and nobody gave him much credence. He was apparently sort of regarded as a bit of an eccentric academic, and he lived in Paynton, and he was sort of fairly much sort of sidelined on that. And it was in the 20s that they suddenly realised that what Heaviside had been telling them was true, and obviously named the Heaviside layer after him at that point. And so it's quite interesting that, you know, they were very much working in the dark, even at in the highest levels. I mean, even Marconi in the early days, nobody knows what frequency he was transmitting on because he had no way of measuring it.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that
I'll
was
stop talking.
James, no, James, that was my point when I introduced you, really, and that is that you are right. I know this, that radio amateurs, given these frequencies, did suddenly, this dawned on, you know, companies like Marconi and others. Oh, actually, they're communicating all over the place on radio with much lower power and bits of wire and so on. That maybe these shortwaves are worth investigating. But obviously, in the history that is generally taught in our schools, if anyone's name is mentioned, it will be, you know, will be the name of Marconi. Maybe it will be the name of Hertz, and so on. It will be one or two figures are given these, but actually, what they started and what they developed is the product of lots and lots of people. Some of them, you know, very eminent scientists, some of them very eminent engineers and physicists, some of them ordinary people, amateurs that are playing with things, and through their play suddenly discover something that someone realizes, actually, this is something we can put to good use. So, you know, it's nice to get that reminder of that, isn't it? There's no such thing as one person who is the inventor of anything. You know, it's the product of hundreds, or potentially in the modern world, thousands of people doing work.
Wasn't it Newton? Was it Newton who said he was standing on the shoulders of giants?
Yes, indeed, yes.
He didn't take credit for all his work. He said it was the other people who built it all up previous that he brought it together.
And wasn't it Einstein who made some comment about half of humanity are so stupid that it's amazing we're still going, or some words to that effect. But James, can I, on behalf of the club, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. It's been a really, really good talk. Can we give our appreciation to James in the normal way, everyone? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James.
Okay. Thank you for your welcome.
And just before you go, I'm just going to say a good evening and good night to our viewers who are watching on YouTube tonight, and also a good whatever it is in the coming weeks to our people who subscribe to our YouTube channel and get an opportunity of watching this film. I hope you get as much pleasure out of watching the film as we did from the talk to you tonight, James. Thank you very much. And I'm sure a number of us in this room will be looking out for GB2GM tomorrow and on Saturday, and hopefully one or two of us will make the contact with you as well, which will be up.
We'll be up on 40 meters and 20 meters.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, James.
Okay.
You're welcome
Thanks
to stay, but equally to go. I'm just going to hit the button to take the recording off and to finally finish off our viewers on YouTube. Terry, go on. Are you just?
It's my thanks. I was so late. I missed the talk just in the conversation afterwards. I will be watching it. I was out this evening. I will be watching the replay. Thank you.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much again, James, and
Okay.
good luck tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.